If I told you to find me an economic miracle, right? Like a country that slashed its infant mortality by almost 90%
Yeah.
and multiplied its national wealth nearly tenfold and completely bypassed its own physical geography to become this like digital services hub, you'd probably guess we were talking about somewhere in Southeast Asia.
Right. Or maybe, an Atlantic outlier like Ireland or something. It is the natural assumption
Exactly.
because we are completely conditioned to associate that kind of explosive modernization with ocean ports and established tech corridors.
But what if the data says this actually happened in a double landlocked post-Soviet state that's historically famous mostly for growing cotton?
It's pretty mind-blowing when you actually look at the number.
It really is.
Yeah.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We have this absolutely massive, comprehensive stack of World Bank macroeconomic and demographic data sets on the table today.
Yeah, and it spans a huge timeline, right? From the early 1990s straight through to the 2020s.
Right. And our subject is the Republic of Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
The mission for you today, as we go through this, is to decode the true narrative of this emerging economic powerhouse.
Because honestly, the outdated stereotypes of a, closed-off, purely agricultural nation just locked deep in the Eurasian landmass, they simply do not survive contact with this data set.
No, they don't.
We are looking at a society that has undergone this incredibly quiet yet explosive structural transformation.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand the scale of what we are looking at, I want you to imagine a hypothetical family living in the rural Fergana Valley back in, say, 1994.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. So the parents pick cotton. The local supply chains have just evaporated because the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right, overnight.
Exactly. Hyperinflation is wiping out whatever meager savings they have, and the nearest medical clinic is constantly facing power outages and medicine shortages. That was the baseline reality.
It was a very grim baseline.
But then, if you fast forward to today, that same family's daughter is statistically likely to be working in a modern service sector.
Yeah.
She's relying on broadband internet that has multiplied its user base by nearly 4,000 times.
It is a phenomenal contrast. And to figure out how a country bridges that massive gap, we have to start at the absolute bedrock of any economy.
Which isn't money.
No, it's not. It's human life.
Right. Looking at the demographic data from the United Nations World Population Prospects, which is embedded in these World Bank files, the early numbers are genuinely difficult to read.
They are.
In the early 90s, right after the Soviet collapse, life expectancy at birth in Uzbekistan was sitting at a fragile 56.5 years.
56.5.
Yeah. Today, that number has pushed past 72.3 years. But the metric that really, stops you in your tracks is the infant and child mortality.
The under 5 mortality rate. It is arguably one of the most critical indicators of a society's overall functionality.
In the past, this rate was a devastating 125.2 per 1,000 live births.
Over 1 in 10 children.
Over 1 in 10 children were not making it to their 5th birthday. The sheer human tragedy of nearly 50,000 infant deaths a year is staggering.
It really is.
But trace that line on the graph to the modern era, and it has crashed down. The English datasets show it hitting 13.3, and some of the more recent localized focus data even tracks it dipping into the 12.1 to 15.2 range.
That is a structural health revolution.
Yeah, and maternal death saw a massive steady decline as well. Now, looking at this health data, my first assumption was that globalization just, inevitably brought better vaccines and generic antibiotics to Central Asia in the 90s and 2000s.
Like a rising tide lifting all boats.
Right. Was this just a passive trickle-down of Western medicine finally reaching them?
That is a very common assumption when looking at developing economies, but the data actually disproves it.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, passive trickle-down doesn't have mortality rates this quickly, especially not in the country that was going through a severe economic contraction at the time.
Oh, that makes sense. You can't just passively improve health when the economy is crashing.
Exactly. A decline this steep and this sustained requires highly coordinated, intentional public health interventions.
So what does that actually look like on the ground?
It means you have to physically build clinics in remote rural areas. You have to train thousands of healthcare workers and deploy them.
Right.
You have to establish reliable cold chains, refrigeration networks that don't fail, so that vaccines survive the trip from a central warehouse in Tashkent out to a desert village.
That sounds like a massive logistical nightmare.
It is. It requires fundamentally upgrading sanitation infrastructure and partnering with global entities like the World Health Organization and UNICEF to fund these localized programs.
So it's not just luck.
No, this is public policy and logistics succeeding on a grand scale.
It's the ultimate victory of public health. But beyond the obvious moral good of saving children's lives, what does this actually do to the mechanics of a country?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, like when tens of thousands of infants are no longer dying every year, how does the society change?
It triggers a fundamental shift in a nation's psychology, which directly dictates its economic planning. This is the core mechanism of what economists call the demographic transition.
Okay, break that down for me.
Historically, when infant mortality rates are high, families tend to have more children. It acts as a sort of tragic insurance policy.
Because you expect to lose some.
Exactly. You have 6 children, hoping that 3 survive to adulthood to help work the farm and care for you in old age.
But when a plunging child mortality rate proves that your children are actually going to survive,
families begin to have fewer children. And crucially, the resources those families have don't get spread as thin.
oh, wow, so they can concentrate their wealth.
Yes, parents can invest exponentially more resources, more nutritious food, better clothing, more dedicated time, and higher education into each individual child.
So it radically boosts the quality of the human capital. You get healthier, better educated kids who have a safety net.
Yeah. And if you fast forward 20 years from that initial health intervention, what does that society look like?
You get a lot of young workers.
You get a massive demographic dividend. You suddenly have this enormous bulge of young, healthy, working-age people entering the labor force.
And we actually see this in the data, right?
We do. If you look closely at the dependency ratios in the data set, you see something fascinating.
I'm going to pull that up. Yeah, the youth dependency ratio is massive, staying in that 60 to 90% range for a long period as that generation grew up.
Right. But while that was happening, the elderly dependency ratio, which is the percentage of the population that is retired and needs support, stayed incredibly low.
It was hovering around just 10 to 11%.
Precisely. Meaning for every 10 workers, there's only about 1 retiree they have to economically support.
That is a huge advantage compared to, like, Japan or Italy today.
It's an incredible economic engine. Meanwhile, specific cohorts of the labor force were just exploding. We see data where certain male working-age demographic segments grew from around 390,000 to over 1.34 million. You have an army of human capital ready to fuel industrial and digital growth. And the surplus wealth they generate isn't being entirely consumed by healthcare for an aging population.
It can be reinvested into the economy.
Exactly. That demographic dividend is the absolute bedrock of their economic rise.
So they secured the foundation, they saved the lives of their people, and that massive, healthy workforce starts producing.
And producing a lot.
Let's look at the wealth they actually generated, because the production numbers in this data set are phenomenal. We tracked the gross national income, or GNI, using the Atlas method.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, if GDP is the total value of everything produced inside the country's borders.
Think of GNI as the total size of the country's wallet. It includes all that domestic production, plus any money sent back home from citizens working abroad.
Right. It is a much more accurate measure of the actual purchasing power and wealth commanded by the residents of the nation.
The data shows this national wallet growing from around $12.8 billion in the early years to staggering modern heights. Total GNI eventually topped $116 billion.
That is a massive jump.
It is. And if we look at purchasing power parity metrics, which, adjusts the numbers based on the local cost of living, the GNI skyrocketed from about $54.5 billion all the way past $363.6 billion.
The wealth multiplier there is just wild.
On an individual level, if we look at constant local currency, per capita GDP leaped from around 1.13 million some to nearly 3.9 million some. It's a huge surge in individual economic output.
But to really appreciate how high they climbed, we have to look at the crater they climbed out of.
The 1990s.
Yeah. The data from the early 1990s shows a brutal economic contraction. The GDP growth rate was negative 11.1%.
Negative 11.1%. I mean, that isn't a recession.
No, that is a depression.
Yeah.
It is an economy collapsing in on itself.
What does that actually look like for our hypothetical family in Fergana?
It was a period of intense trauma across the entire former Soviet Union. For decades, the local economy was deeply intertwined with Moscow.
Right, the central planning.
When that centralized system vanished overnight, the supply chains completely severed. Factories in Uzbekistan suddenly had no raw materials from Russia or Ukraine.
Farms couldn't sell their goods to the usual state buyers.
Exactly. The currency was in free fall, hyperinflation wiped out a lifetime of savings in a matter of months, and the state struggled to pay basic pensions. It was a crisis of absolute survival.
So it's like looking at a startup that launched, immediately faced an 11% churn rate, lost its main investors, and was running on fumes.
That's a great analogy.
But then it somehow pivots, finds perfect product market fit, and completely scales its revenue. Because after that brutal crash, the annual GDP growth rates didn't just recover.
No, they surged.
They consistently hit the 7% to 9.4% range during the peak years of the 2000s and 2010s.
And it is vital to explain a key piece of the metadata here. These massive growth metrics we are talking about, they are calculated in constant US dollars and purchasing power parity.
Right, which is super important.
Because when you are looking at emerging markets, you always have to be skeptical and ask, is this just a numerical illusion created by local hyperinflation?
Are the numbers going up just because the local currency is becoming worthless?
Right, like someone boasting they're a millionaire, but they live in a country where a loaf of bread costs $1 million.
Exactly. But by using constant dollars in PPP, the World Bank data proves this is not an inflationary illusion.
It is genuine compounding wealth creation. The real, tangible value of the goods and services this country was producing was multiplying year after year.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wealth accumulation at this speed completely rewires a nation's position on the geopolitical chessboard.
Absolutely.
You aren't just a fragile state needing emergency aid anymore. You become a market. You become an investment destination.
But to sustain that growth, to become a true global player, you have to fundamentally change what it is you are selling.
Which brings us to the structural rewiring of the entire economy.
Yeah, this is the pivot.
For decades, Uzbekistan was synonymous with one thing: agriculture, specifically cotton. They called it white gold.
The entire system was heavily reliant on pulling resources out of the dirt.
But the data shows a massive shift. We looked at the metric for services value added as a percentage of GDP. It rose from around 31.5% to over 42%.
That's a massive reallocation of capital.
In US dollars, the service sector added value eventually climbed past $51.9 billion. It is now the absolute powerhouse of their wealth creation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this transition is the classic hallmark of a developing nation escaping what economists call the single commodity trap.
The single commodity trap. If you ever had all your retirement savings heavily invested in a single tech stock and then the market crashed, you understand exactly what this means.
You have zero diversification.
Right. If a country only sells cotton and the global price of cotton drops by half, the entire national budget goes bankrupt.
Or, if there's a severe drought, your economy simply evaporates. When a nation is entirely reliant on primary agriculture or raw resource extraction like natural gas, it is completely at the mercy of the weather and the whims of the global commodities market.
You have zero pricing power.
You are just a price taker. Uzbekistan realized they couldn't just sell cotton and gas forever if they wanted to build a resilient middle class.
They had to move up the value chain.
They had to start trading intangible services.
And the data proves they did exactly that. Looking at the balance of payments data, the commercial service imports and exports spike massively.
Yeah, the international trade numbers are fascinating here.
But you can't build a service economy without fundamentally altering the lives of the workers. And we found some amazing cross-reference data regarding gender and labor migration.
The occupational shifts are profound. The percentage of female employment in agriculture dropped from a high of around 36.2% steadily down to 25.6%.
While at the same time, male employment in the service sector climbed from around 37.4% to over 46%. So what does this all mean for the people actually living there?
It means the economy is physically moving.
Right. People are leaving the rural fields and migrating to urban centers to work in logistics, finance, telecom, and retail.
Going back to our family in Fergana, the destiny of the individual worker is completely transformed.
A young woman today is far less likely to be tied to the back-breaking, seasonal agricultural labor that her mother or grandmother was forced into.
It represents a massive shift in economic agency. It is the deep modernization of the labor market.
But there is a catch.
There's always a catch.
To build a modern service economy, especially an IT service economy, you need immense infrastructure. And waiting for that service economy to bloom reveals a massive geographic roadblock for this specific country.
Right. You can train 1 million IT workers, but how do you actually export what they create?
Because Uzbekistan isn't just landlocked. It is one of only 2 countries on planet Earth that is double landlocked.
Liechtenstein being the other.
Being double landlocked means you are completely surrounded by countries that are also landlocked.
It's a geographic prison.
To get a physical good, a crate of cotton, a shipment of electronics, anything to a seaport, you have to cross at least 2 international borders.
Geographically speaking, that is an immense penalty on trade. We don't often think about the friction of physical borders, but every single border crossing is a toll booth.
It adds tariffs.
It requires customs inspections, which cause delays, it introduces bribery risks, and it multiplies transportation costs.
Historically, physical geography was destiny. If you didn't have a port or a navigable river leading to a port, you were largely excluded from global trade. You were poor. So how do you escape that? You look at the telecommunications data found deep in the World Bank footnotes. We tracked fixed broadband subscriptions.
And this is where the numbers get really crazy.
In the early days, the data shows they had barely 2,757 broadband users in the entire country.
2,757 for a whole nation.
Fast forward, and that number goes completely exponential, hitting over 10.79 million subscriptions.
That is nearly a 4,000-fold increase.
A 4,000-fold increase.
And this is the magic of the 21st century economy. Digital connectivity is the ultimate geographic loophole.
You can't easily walk out the front door to trade with your neighbors, so you build a massive fiber optic network instead.
Precisely. The internet doesn't care about the 2 borders between you and the ocean. You don't need a deep water seaport to export a software application to Berlin.
You don't need a cargo ship to run a global customer service center or to process financial data for a European bank.
An optical cable bypasses the customs checkpoints in Kazakhstan entirely. Uzbekistan bypassed its physical geography with digital infrastructure.
It is a total connectivity revolution.
Right.
And once that digital infrastructure was in place, it had massive knock-on effects for their domestic business environment.
We can see that in the regulatory data.
The data shows the time required to get a business license plummeted to just about 6.5 days.
Which is a huge leap in institutional efficiency.
Oh, absolutely. And the density of new business registrations. So the number of new companies per 1,000 working age people, that jumped from 0.53 up to 2.75.
When you have high-speed internet and the government slashes the red tape, the private sector naturally explodes.
But we have to ask the critical operational question here.
Where does the money come from?
Exactly. Building that digital infrastructure, building those urban service centers, establishing that public health cold chain we talked about earlier, it takes cash. An immense amount of capital.
Right.
Where did a country that was suffering an 11% economic contraction a couple of decades ago find the money to build a modern nation?
They had to open their doors to global capital and development aid.
The data reveals massive influxes of official development assistance, or ODA, and foreign direct investment.
We see funds pouring in from DEEC donors, the Development Assistance Committee, meaning countries like the U.S., Japan, Germany, and the EU institutions.
We also see massive net financial flows from UN agencies, UNICEF, UNDP, the World Health Organization.
But they didn't just take grants. They borrowed heavily.
Yes. The data set tracks their long-term public and publicly guaranteed debt, often abbreviated as PPG. A huge portion of this external debt comes from the IDRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the IDA, the International Development Association. Hold on, I want to stop right here because we need to look at this critically.
Sure.
They're taking on billions of dollars in external debt from these massive international organizations to fund this transformation. Aren't we just looking at a country financing a luxury lifestyle on a national credit card?
The fair concern.
Is this economic miracle just a debt bubble waiting to pop the second the global interest rates shift?
It's the exact right question to ask because we have seen that exact scenario play out in other developing nations. Debt can be a fatal trap or it can be a highly effective lever.
The difference being?
The difference lies entirely in the terms of the debt and what the capital is actually used for.
Explain the mechanism there. How is this debt different?
First, we have to demystify these organizations. The data shows us that much of their borrowing, especially from the IDA, was highly concessional.
Meaning?
Concessional debt is not like swiping a credit card. Think of it more like a heavily subsidized student loan. It comes with incredibly favorable terms, extremely low interest rates, extended grace periods before repayment begins, and very long payback periods.
Sometimes these loans have massive grant elements built right into them, right?
Exactly.
So this isn't high-interest, short-term commercial borrowing from private banks that can trigger a sovereign default overnight if the market panics.
No, the structure of the debt protects the borrower. Furthermore, look at what they spent the capital on.
Right.
If a country borrows money to fund bloated government payrolls or to import luxury consumer goods, that is a trap. But Uzbekistan spent it on human capital. Remember the plunging infant mortality thanks to WHO and UNICEF interventions.
And they spent it on digital infrastructure, the fiber optic networks,
They essentially took out a low-interest business loan to build a factory.
instead of a personal loan to buy a sports car.
Precisely. If your economy is growing at 7 to 9% a year, and your debt is locked in at highly concessional rates of maybe 1 or 2%, your debt to GNI ratio remains entirely manageable.
It is productive leverage.
The foreign capital fueled the economic engine, and the engine produced enough new wealth to easily service the debt while keeping a massive surplus.
Okay, so we've mapped out this incredible rise. The population is healthier than ever. The wealth has multiplied exponentially. They've shifted away from relying purely on cotton and moved into services.
They bypassed their double landlocked geography with the internet.
And they smartly leveraged global capital to pay for it all. It sounds like a complete utopia.
Yeah.
But every time you see a massive spike in GDP, there is a shadow. The World Bank data measures more than just money and internet cables. It measures the health of the system itself.
And this is where the music stops, because the structural pains of this rapid growth are becoming undeniable.
Let's pivot to the worldwide governance indicators, the WGI. This part of the dataset is incredibly sobering.
And just to be clear for you listening, we're not taking any political stance here. We are strictly looking at what the World Bank governance indicators report and how that historically impacts foreign investment and economic stability.
Exactly. We are just reading the data. And the data shows that despite hundreds of billions of dollars in new economic activity, the country's percentile rank for controlling corruption has historically hovered in the absolute bottom tiers globally.
Sometimes fluctuating between the 0 to 16th percentile.
Now, to be fair to the data, their regulatory quality metric has climbed a bit from its lowest points, pushing up toward the 31.9th percentile.
But it is still fundamentally operating in the lower middle tier globally. And this synthesizes the core tension of this entire deep dive.
How so?
The economic engine and the digital infrastructure of Uzbekistan have sprinted into the 21st century. But the governance, the regulatory transparency, the institutional frameworks, they are struggling, breathing heavily, trying to keep up with the sheer velocity of the money.
Think about it like trying to run the latest, most advanced smartphone operating system on a piece of hardware from 15 years ago.
It might boot up.
It might even run a few basic apps. But eventually, the processor overheats, it lags, and the system crashes. That's what happens when rapid GDP growth completely outpaces institutional reform.
You get wealth, but you also get massive friction.
You get inequality, and you build systemic vulnerabilities into the economy.
If left unaddressed, this friction is the exact recipe for the middle-income trap.
Explain how that trap works mechanically. Why does corruption stop growth?
A country can grow rapidly from low income to middle income simply by deploying foreign capital and mobilizing basic labor.
You move people from the farms to the factories or to basic service jobs, and the GDP shoots up.
That is the catch-up phase. But to go from a middle-income country to a high-income country, basic labor isn't enough. You need innovation.
You need complex financial markets.
You need deep trust in the legal system. You need perfectly enforceable contracts. And you need a fiercely protected intellectual property environment.
Right, because if corruption is high and courts are unpredictable, foreign investors will eventually hit the brakes.
Local entrepreneurs will stop taking risks because they fear their successful businesses might be arbitrarily seized. The growth hits a hard ceiling.
And it's not just the governance metrics that are flashing a warning light. There are severe human and environmental costs hidden in this growth.
Let's talk about the education data.
In the footnotes of the education data, we found a metric for something called learning poverty. This is the percentage of children at the end of primary school age who cannot read and understand a simple text.
The data shows it sits at a shocking 32.36%.
Wait, almost a third of the kids? I mean, earlier we established that primary school enrollment is basically universal.
Right. The data shows female and male retention to the last grade of primary school is hovering around 97 to 99%.
So they are in the classroom.
Exactly. They're physically sitting at the desks. But the learning poverty rate is 32.36%. It highlights the massive difference between the quantity of education and the quality of education.
The quantity goal has been achieved, but the quality of the instruction is failing a significant portion of them.
And if we tie that back to the economic transition, if 1/3 of your future workforce lacks basic reading comprehension, your dream of transitioning to a high-tech digital service economy has a fatal flaw.
You can build all the broadband networks you want, but if the workforce can't write code or manage complex logistics, the hardware is useless.
This is a hollowed-out human capital crisis waiting to happen.
And it's not just human capital. We have to look at the physical environment, too.
Right, the greenhouse gas emissions data is really a tough pill to swallow.
It is. Total emissions, if you exclude land use changes, surged from around 7.5 million tons to over 19.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent.
And that's heavily driven by energy and transport. It's the hidden cost of the GDP rocket we were just talking about.
Yeah, we celebrate the wealth going up, but the data also tracks this metric called adjusted savings, energy depletion, and it shows the country losing over $1.1 billion in natural wealth in some years.
They're burning their own ecological foundation to build the cities of tomorrow.
It's a highly extractive, brute force phase of economic growth.
We can synthesize all of these conflicting data points into a mental 4-quadrant matrix for you to really understand where the country stands today.
Let's build that out. In the top right quadrant, you have the high achievements and massive momentum.
You have the absolute miracles of public health saving tens of thousands of children.
You have the 4,000-fold explosion in broadband internet that bypassed their landlocked geography.
You have the compounding surge in gross national income, driven by a smart pivot from agriculture to services.
But in the bottom right quadrant, you have the high structural risks that demand immediate attention.
You have a 32% learning poverty rate threatening the competency of the future workforce.
You have skyrocketing carbon emissions and rapid natural resource depletion.
And you have an anti-corruption framework that is ranked in the lowest tiers globally.
The World Bank data doesn't paint a picture of a utopia, and it certainly doesn't paint a dystopia. It paints a picture of an incredibly dynamic, living nation at a massive inflection point.
They've effectively maxed out the benefits of catch-up growth. They pulled all the easy levers.
Stopping preventable diseases with vaccines, laying down basic internet cables, moving workers from the cotton fields to urban centers.
But the next phase of economic evolution is always the hardest. The question becomes, how do you transition from capital-driven growth to innovation-driven growth?
You do it by matching your incredible investments in physical health with equal investments in institutional health.
Exactly. Building a high-speed broadband network is ultimately just an engineering problem. You just need enough money and enough cables.
But solving a 32% learning poverty rate, rooting out systemic corruption so that entrepreneurs trust the legal system, reining in 19 million tons of carbon emissions while keeping the economy growing.
Those aren't engineering problems. Those are complex, generational human problems.
It requires a fundamental shift in governance philosophy. The easy growth is behind them. The complex growth lies ahead.
Let's recap this incredible journey for you.
We started by looking at a post-Soviet state in the early 1990s, suffering from an 11% economic depression, heartbreaking rates of child mortality, and locked away from global trade behind multiple international borders.
And we watched, through the data, as that country built a public health miracle, laid down a digital nervous system, invited in global development capital, and generated hundreds of billions of dollars in new wealth by pivoting to a modern service economy.
It is a profound success story of human resilience and macroeconomic strategy. But as the Matrix shows us, it is a story that is only half written.
Exactly. The data proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that an incredible economic engine has been constructed in Central Asia. It has built immense physical and financial power.
But to truly establish itself globally, to escape the middle income trap and become a sustainable high income power, it must evolve past its old institutional shell.
The ultimate question for the next decade isn't whether Uzbekistan can build faster internet networks or attract more foreign direct investment.
They have clearly proven they have the capacity to do that.
The real question you should be asking, and what you should be watching for in the global headlines, is whether its internal governance, its educational quality, and its environmental stewardship can evolve fast enough to fairly distribute, manage, and protect that massive new wealth.
Will the institutional hardware finally be upgraded to support the 21st century operating system? Can the Central Asian dragon shed its old scales and truly fly? That is the true test of their future. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We'll see you next time.